"She rides with me," said the drifter as her father counted his silver. There's a smell to money that most men never notice because they've always had some near them. A particular sweetness, like old wood and tallow both, something that lives in the crease of a man's palm when he's been handling coin all morning. I noticed it the first time I walked into Harlan Creed's house, before I even looked up from the doormat. Before I saw the portraits on the wall, or the oil lamp burning at noon, or the oak desk he sat behind like a man who'd appointed himself judge of the whole county. I smelled his money, and I thought that smell is why I left. I had ridden in from Laramie. 3 weeks out, 2 nights of bad weather, 1 lame horse. I had to rest for 4 days at a creek crossing nobody had named. My coat was stiff from dried rain, and my hat brim had a crack in it that let light through in a thin stripe. I wasn't much to look at. I knew that. I'd known it a long time. But I had a reason to come to Cutter's Fork. Her name was in a letter a man named Donahue had pressed into my hand in a Laramie saloon. Donahue was an old freighter, half-deaf, and he said the letter had come west in a postal bag 2 months prior, passed from hand to hand the way letters do when there's no sure address. He thought it was mine. It had my full name on the front, Cal Whitmore, and that was unusual enough that he was right to track me. The letter was from her, from Lena Creed. I had not heard her name in 11 years. I had not said it aloud to anyone in about the same stretch. There are names that way, names you carry without saying, like a stone in your coat pocket that you've stopped noticing is there until one day you put your hand in and find it again and remember the exact afternoon you picked it up. She wrote, "Cal, I know this may not reach you, and I know it's a poor use of paper to write to a man who lives on no road. But I am going to write it and hope. My father has made an arrangement. There is a man named Galt. He runs cattle east of town, and he has made a proposal, and my father has accepted, and I did not know about either until the morning I found them sitting together over coffee, papers already on the table. I am telling you because there is no one else to tell. You were the only one who ever listened when I spoke. I am not asking you to come. I am just telling you because I thought about writing to someone and it was always going to be you. L." I read that letter twice in the saloon, once in the street, and once more at my horse, which was a bay gelding I called Patch on account of the white on his left shoulder. Then I put it in my breast pocket, and I paid for my oats and I started south. I want to be honest about something. I had not been a good man to know these 11 years. I had taken work where work presented itself, and some of that work had been the kind that decent people put on one side of the ledger and won't speak of over dinner. I had ridden for outfits that were only barely on the near side of the law, and once or twice I'd crossed over that line without a great deal of argument with myself about it. I was not an outlaw, but I was not much of a churchgoer either. I'd had a reputation in 3 territories for being handy with a gun, which is the kind of reputation that follows a man even when he'd rather it didn't, and I had stopped trying to outride it sometime around the end of my 30s. I was 43 years old when I rode into Cutter's Fork. I had gray in my beard and a scar along my left forearm from a man who'd objected to being told his horse was stolen, which it was. My knee ached in cold weather. I'd lost 2 back teeth. I was not the same man who had sat on the split-rail fence behind the Creed property 11 years prior, and watched Lena carry a bucket from the well in the August heat and thought, with perfect certainty, that she was the finest woman he had ever seen. But I was the man who had come. Whatever I was the man who came. I did not go to the Creed house first. That would have been foolish. I put Patch in at the livery, paid a week in advance, and I went and sat in the town's one eating house, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Purdy who had arms like a blacksmith and made good biscuits. I ate slowly and I listened. That's a skill I'd developed over the years, the kind of listening you do when you're new in a place and you want to understand the weather before you step outside. What I heard in fragments over 2 meals and a pot of bad coffee was this. Harlan Creed owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He was not a bad man in the way that men who use a fist are bad men, but he was the kind of man who believed his judgment was final, and he'd had enough years of nobody contradicting him that he'd settled into that belief, the way a man settles into a good chair. He had one daughter, Lena, who was 31, and who, the woman at the counter said without my asking, had a mind of her own that Harlan had been trying to manage for about 31 years without notable success. The man named Galt was Silas Galt. He ran 1,200 head east of the canyon. He was 49, twice widowed, and he had money enough that Harlan had decided he was suitable. He was not a cruel man, 2 people said. He was just a man who owned things and expected to keep owning them. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the street, which was dry and pale in the October sun. A wagon went by with a load of fence posts. A dog crossed without hurrying. I thought about Lena carrying that bucket in the August heat, and I thought about how a letter finds a man sometimes right when it ought to, and I went back to the livery and slept in the hay next to Patch, because the town had no hotel and I had slept in worse places. In the morning, I rode out to the Creed property. Harlan Creed met me on the porch before I'd finished dismounting. He had the look of a man who'd seen me coming and had time to arrange his face into something that wasn't quite welcome. He was heavier than I remembered. His hair was white now, and his mustache was still full, and he wore a good wool vest that probably cost more than my horse. He said, "Whitmore." I said, "Mr. Creed." He did not offer his hand. He did say, "Come in, I suppose," which was as close to hospitality as he'd ever managed with me. That was when I smelled the money, standing in the front room with its oil lamp and its portraits and the oak desk, and Harlan sitting behind it before I was fully through the door. He had the ease of a man in his own court. I had seen judges sit that way. I had seen ranch bosses sit that way. I had seen one Mexican patron sit that way in a hacienda outside Sonora, a man who controlled a valley the size of some states. They all had the same posture. It says, "I have been right here a long time, and I expect to keep being right here." I took off my hat. I did not sit down because he hadn't offered it. He said, "I'm going to assume you got some kind of word from Lena." I said I had. He said she had no business doing that. I said, "A woman has some business in decisions about her own life." He looked at me for a moment with the particular patience of a man who is not going to argue a point he considers already settled. Then he said, "Lena is going to marry Silas Galt in the spring. It's a good arrangement. Good for her, good for this land, and good for this family. Galt is a substantial man." I said, "I'm sure he is." "You are not a substantial man, Whitmore." I let that sit for a moment. It wasn't wrong exactly in the way he meant it. I didn't own land. I didn't have cattle. I didn't have a deed to anything in any county in any territory. I had a horse and a saddle and a bedroll and a rifle and a Colt that I'd carried so long the grip had worn smooth. I was not a substantial man by the measure Harlan Creed used. I said, "Where is Lena?" He said, "She's not going to see you." I said, "I'd like to hear that from her." He stood up then, and he was still a big man, Harlan Creed. He put his hands flat on the desk, and he leaned forward the way a man does when he wants you to remember the size of him. He said, "You left. 11 years ago you left this valley, and you left her, and you went off to do whatever it is men like you do out there. She got on with her life. Let her get on with it." I said, "I'd like to hear that from her." He said, "You'll hear it from me." And I put my hat back on and I nodded once, which wasn't agreement, and I walked back out to my horse. I had not gone 50 yards down the road when I heard her. She called my name from somewhere off to my left, past the fence line, and I turned, and there she was at the corner of the horse pasture, standing with her hand on the top rail and her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her coat. A man's canvas coat that was too big, buttoned to the throat against the October cold. She looked older in the way a woman who has worked outdoors looks older, which is not a bad older. She looked like what she was, a real person, not the picture I'd carried. I got down off Patch and walked to the fence. She didn't move from her side of it. She said, "You came." I said, "You wrote to me." She said, "I told you I wasn't asking you to come." I said, "I know what you told me." She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that I could not quite name. She said, "You look like you've had a hard 11 years. I said, "I've had them." She said, "I'm sorry about the letter. I should not have sent it." I said, "I'm glad you did." The wind moved through the dry grass in the pasture. One of the horses, a gray, walked up to the fence to investigate and then lost interest and walked away. Lena watched me with an expression that was not soft and not hard, but was very steady, the way she had always been steady. I had never met a woman steadier. I had not always known what to do with that steadiness when I was younger. I said, "Tell me about Galt." She shook her head slightly. "He's not a bad man. My father is not a bad man. They both believe they are doing what is right." I said, "What do you believe?" She looked away across the pasture. She said, "I believe I am 31 years old, and I have been on this property nearly every day of those 31 years, and I am tired of waiting for my life to resemble something I would have chosen." I said, "Then let me ride out with you." She turned back and looked at me very directly. She said, "You cannot show up after 11 years and say something like that." I said, "I just did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she almost smiled, which I remembered. The almost smile. The way she held it back when something struck her as funny and she thought it shouldn't. She said, "I need some time." I said, "I have time. I'm not going anywhere." She said, "Don't make promises like that." I said, "I'm not promising anything. I'm telling you the plain truth. I have nowhere pressing to be, and I'm not of a mind to leave." She looked at me a while longer. Then she said, "Go away, Cal, go away and I'll think." So I went. I spent 3 days in Cutter's Fork. I ate at Mrs. Purdy's and I walked Patch in the evenings and I slept in the livery and I talked to people. Not about Lena or Harlan or Galt. Just talked, the way you do when you're in a new place and you want the shape of it. I talked to the livery man who was named Arlo, a slight man with big hands who knew horses the way some men know music, instinctively, without being able to explain what they knew. I talked to the blacksmith. I talked to an old cattle hand named Suggs, who drank his morning coffee on a bench in front of the general store, and had opinions about everything, and was right about most of it. On the second afternoon, Silas Galt came to see me. He came to the livery, which I thought was decent of him. He was a big man, Galt, heavier than me and wider in the shoulders. He wore a good coat and good boots, and he had the kind of face that time makes plain, not handsome but clear, the kind of face where you can see what the man actually thinks. He looked at me steadily. He didn't offer his hand right away. He said, "You're Whitmore." I said I was. He sat down on a hay bale without asking, which I thought was also decent. He said, "Harlan tells me you and Lena have some history." I said we did. He said, "I want to tell you something. I am not a man who enjoys contest. I am not interested in fighting over a woman who does not want to be fought over. I want to say that plainly." I looked at him. I said, "What is it you're trying to say?" He said, "I am saying that if Lena Creed does not want to marry me, I am not going to marry her. But I'd like to know one way or the other before I make any more arrangements." I said, "That sounds like a conversation to have with Lena." He said, "I intend to. I came to you first because I wanted to know what kind of man you are." I said, "What kind of man am I?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "A man who rode 3 weeks to get here. That tells me something." He stood up and he put his hat back on and he said, "I'm going to talk to Lena tomorrow." He went. I sat with Patch for a while, and I thought that Silas Galt was a more decent man than most situations give you, and that didn't change anything. On the third morning Lena came to town. She came alone. on a small red roan she'd had since it was a colt, and she tied it in front of the general store, and she walked the length of the street until she found me sitting outside the eating house with a cup of coffee. She sat down across the table from me without being asked. She said, "Silas came to see me yesterday." I said I knew. She said, "He told me he would release my father from the arrangement if I wished it." I said, "He seems like a fair man." She said, "He is. He said he did not want a wife who'd rather be somewhere else." She was quiet for a moment. She was watching the street, not me. There was dust moving in the road, stirred by a mule team pulling a flat wagon. She watched it the way she watched most things, with a kind of deliberate attention that I had always thought was its own kind of intelligence. Then she said, "What do you want, Cal?" I said, "I want you to ride out with me." She said, "Ride out to where?" I said, "I don't have a particular destination, but I know good range when I see it, and I've got a little saved, and I know how to work. I'm telling you, I'm 43 years old, and I've been moving since I was 21, and I'm tired of moving. I want something to stay for." She looked at me then. She said, "You're asking me to leave everything I've ever known for a man who has been gone 11 years. I said, "I'm asking you to ride out with me. What comes after that we figure out together." She said, "My father will not forgive this." I said, "That may be. But you said you were 31 years old and tired of waiting for a life you'd have chosen." She looked at the dust settling in the road, and she was very still for a long time. Then she said, "When?" And something in my chest that had been knotted for about 3 weeks or possibly 11 years unwound, slowly, like a wire taken off a post. I said, "You say when?" She said, "Give me 2 days." I said, "I'll be here." She took 1 day. I heard the roan's hooves on the packed earth of the livery yard in the middle of the second morning, and I stepped out, and she was there with the roan and a pack horse loaded even, and she was wearing the canvas coat and her hair was up under her hat, and she had an expression on her face that was resolved and a little pale and very clear. She said, "I left a letter for my father." I said, "All right." She said, "I said goodbye to the horses. I know that sounds foolish." I said, "It doesn't sound foolish." She looked at me. She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "I've been ready since Laramie." We rode north out of Cutter's Fork in the middle of that October morning, me on Patch and Lena on the roan and the pack horse behind on a lead line, and the valley was wide and brown and gold, and the sky was the deep hard blue that October gives you sometimes in the high country. We didn't talk for the first hour. There wasn't any need to. The talking would come. There was plenty of road and plenty of time. I thought about what Harlan Creed would do with that letter. I thought he would be angry, and then I thought he would sit in the chair behind that oak desk with his hands flat on the arms of it, and he would think, the way a man like him thinks when the thing he thought was settled turns out to not be settled. And eventually he would be all right. Men like Harlan always are. They have enough around them to fill in the space when someone goes. I thought about Silas Gault, and I hoped he would find a woman who was glad to be there. I thought about the letter in my breast pocket, which I still had, which I would probably keep. You are the only one who ever listened when I spoke. I had held a lot of things in my life and done a lot of things and been called a lot of things, and I was not sure I had ever been called anything that mattered as much as that one line. That a woman had written to me, out of everyone she knew, because I had listened. Because I'd been the kind of man who listened to her. Whatever else I had been that. We made 15 miles the first day, which was reasonable for 2 loaded horses in October with no reason to hurry. The road out of Cutter's Fork was a freighter's road, well rutted, and for the first few miles I watched the back trail out of habit. Nobody following. A man on a buckboard going the other direction touched his hat to Lena without looking at me, which told me something about how things stood in the valley. She was known. I was not. That was fine. The country opened up north of town, the mountains going blue in the west and the flat grass country spreading east, and it was the kind of country that feels large enough to get lost in, which was a comfort. Not hiding exactly, just space. Room enough that Harlan Creed's reach would thin out gradually and then stop, the way a sound stops when you've walked far enough from its source. We camped in a narrow canyon with a creek and cottonwoods, and I got a fire going and cooked what I had, which was beans and salt pork, and Lena had brought biscuits and coffee, real coffee, better than Mrs. Purdy's. She'd packed, well, 2 good wool blankets, a small axe, a canvas tarp for the gear, a bag of oats for the horses. Whoever had taught her to prepare for a journey had taught her right, or she'd figured it out herself, which was more likely. We ate without much ceremony, and the fire burned down to coals, and the creek made its sound, and the cottonwood leaves rattled in the dark like distant applause. She said, "I keep thinking I should feel more frightened." I said, "Do you?" She said, "Not particularly. I feel like I ought to, because everything I know is back there." I said, "What do you feel instead?" She thought about it. The fire popped. A log shifted and a spray of sparks came up and died out against the dark. She watched them go. She said, "Like I can breathe." We were quiet for a while. The creek ran and the horses shifted in the dark, and the night was very clear, cold enough to see your breath but not cold enough to hurt. I said, "You don't have to justify it to anyone. Not to me, not to yourself." She said, "I know that." I said, "Some days you might feel like you do." She considered this for a moment, turned it over. She said, "Maybe. But not tonight." She picked up a stick and turned it in her hands, not for any purpose, just turning it. She had a way of doing things with her hands while she thought. I remembered that. It was the same. She used to do it with a piece of grass or a harness strap or whatever was at hand when we used to talk out behind the barn, years ago, before I'd turned 22 and gotten foolish about it. She said, "My mother used to sit outside after supper, not doing anything, just sitting. My father thought it was wasteful. He'd say, 'What are you doing out there?' And she'd say, 'Thinking.' And he'd say, 'Thinking about what?' And she'd say, 'Nothing in particular.'" She put the stick down. "I used to do it too, and it drove him near to madness." I said, "Sounds useful." She said, "It is. That's what I'm doing now." She lay back on her bedroll and looked up at the strip of sky between the canyon walls, which was crowded with stars all the way to the edges, and after a while I lay back on mine and we listened to the creek until she was asleep, which didn't take long. The fire went out on its own. I lay awake a while longer. That's a habit, lying awake after others sleep, listening to what's around you, old habit from years of camps where you couldn't be sure of the dark. There was nothing in that dark to worry about. The horses were easy. The night was still. I listened anyway, and after a while I slept. She said, "Where did you go? After you left, I mean. Where did you actually go?" I said, "Wyoming first, then Montana for a stretch, down through Colorado. I spent almost 2 years in New Mexico working for a cattle outfit out of Santa Fe, then Texas for a while. Then I started drifting back north without any particular reason." She said, "Were you ever happy?" It was a straight question, and she asked it the way she asked most things, without softening it first. I thought about it honestly. I said, "There were stretches where I didn't think about it, which isn't the same thing, but it's something." She nodded. She said, "Why did you leave the first time?" I said, "Because your father made it plain I wasn't what he had in mind. And I was young enough and proud enough, and not yet smart enough to understand that a woman can decide things for herself." She said, "I could have decided for myself then." I said, "I know that now." She looked at me across the coals. She said, "You could have stayed and let me." I said, "I know." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Don't do that again." I said, "No." She said, "I mean it. Whatever comes, don't decide for me." I said, "You have my word." And I meant it. I had done enough deciding for both of us already, and look where that had gotten, 11 years of both our lives. On the 4th day out we hit trouble. which I should have expected because trouble on a trail is not exceptional. It's just a question of what kind. 3 men came up behind us on a stretch of open road through dry grass and sage. They'd been following since mid-morning. I'd noticed them at a distance and watched to see what they'd do, and what they did was close the gap steadily, which told me what I needed to know. When they were 100 yards back, I pulled Patch to a stop and told Lena to keep the pack horse close behind her, and she did it without question. The 3 men pulled up 10 yards off. The one in the front was young, maybe 25, with a red bandana around his neck and the particular loose confidence of a man who hasn't yet been seriously hurt. The other 2 were older. One of them I almost recognized, but almost didn't matter. The young one said, "Nice outfit." "Going far?" I said, "Far enough." He said, "That pack horse looks heavy." I said, "It is." He smiled. He said, "We'd like to help lighten it." There was a moment then, one of those moments that aren't long but feel long, where everything is in the air and nobody has moved yet, and the question is who is going to do what first. I had been in those moments more times than I could count. I had learned to be very still inside them. Not calm, exactly, something more useful than calm. Just still. I said quietly, without moving my hands toward anything yet, "You have the look of men who have done this before. So I'm going to say something that I mean. The woman behind me is under my protection. You're going to ride around us and keep going." The young one said, "And if we don't?" I said, "Then you'll have a very bad afternoon." He looked at me for a moment, and I watched him calculate, the way young men calculate, which is mostly wrong. He was seeing an older man with gray in his beard and a cracked hat brim, and a horse that looked like it had done hard miles. He was not seeing what the older one of his companions was seeing, because the older man had gone very still and was watching me with the careful eyes of someone who knew the math. The young one said, "There's 3 of us." I said, "I know how to count." The older one said something to the young one in a low voice, and the young one's smile got thinner. The older one looked at me for a moment longer, and then he said, "Ride around," and turned his horse, and the other 2 followed after a beat, and they went wide around us through the sage and kept going without looking back. Lena had not made a sound. When they were out of sight, I turned Patch, and she was sitting the roan with both hands on the reins and her chin level, and her eyes on the place where the men had been. There was color in her cheeks, but her jaw was set. She said, "You didn't draw." I said, "Didn't need to." She said, "You knew they'd go." I said, "I hoped." She said, "How did you know?" I said, "The older one recognized something." Men who have been around long enough, they recognize when they're dealing with someone who has already done the thing they're thinking about doing. It changes the math. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I wasn't afraid." I said, "I know, you sat still." She said, "Is that the right thing?" I said, "It's what you did, and it was right." We rode on. The sage moved in a light wind, and the sky was very high and white and far away. I felt her eyes on the back of my head for a while, and I thought about that, the feeling of a woman watching you and the watching being something other than judgment, something closer to consideration, closer to, maybe, deciding. We made 20 miles that day, which was the most we'd done. Neither of us said anything about the 3 men. There wasn't any need to. That evening we camped on an exposed flat with no canyon walls for shelter, and the wind came down hard out of the northwest, and we put the horses to block it from one side, and the gear stacked on the other, and we were close to the fire out of necessity. I noticed she didn't move away when the fire burned down and the cold came in. I didn't move away either. She said, "What do you do when you're not working?" I said, "Sleep mostly." She said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "I know, I just didn't have a good answer ready. I thought about it. I read when I can find something, I fix gear. I've been known to play cards, which I'm mediocre at. I watch things, I suppose, country, weather, how people move." She said, "You were watching me when you came to the fence." I said I was. She said, "What were you watching for?" I said, "To see if you'd changed." She said, "And?" I said, "You hadn't, not in any way that mattered." She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Then she said, "What does that mean, any way that mattered?" I said, "You're still the steadiest person I've ever been near. Some people, they move through their life like they're managing it every minute, always looking for what's going wrong. You sit in it. Whatever it is, you sit in it and look at it straight." She didn't say anything to that for a while. Then she said, "My mother was like that. My father called it stubbornness." I said, "It isn't stubbornness." She said, "No, it isn't." We let the fire go lower and the wind eased sometime after midnight, and in the morning the sky was clear and bitter cold, and the horses were restless to move, which suited us both. We spent the nights together, and we did not act on it for a while because neither of us was in a hurry. There are things that are better for not being rushed, and I had rushed enough things in my life to know the difference. We talked a great deal, which I had not expected. I had remembered her as a woman who listened more than she talked, but that had been in another life, in a place where she was watched all the time, in a house where every word was weighed before it was said. Out here she talked. She talked about the horses on the Creed property, each one by name and temperament. She talked about a book she'd read 3 times about a man who went to sea and what she thought about it. She talked about what she'd wanted to be when she was young, which was a physician, and why she had given up wanting it, which was practical and sad in equal measure. She talked about her mother, who had died when Lena was 12. She talked about her father with more fairness than I could have managed about a man who'd spent 31 years trying to manage her will, and I learned something from listening to her be that fair. She listened too. She asked about Montana, and I told her. She asked about the cattle work in New Mexico, and I told her. She asked about the reputation, about what it actually meant day to day to be known as a man who was good with a gun, and I told her that too, not proudly, but plainly, because that was the only way to tell it. She listened without flinching, which I had not been entirely sure she would. She said once, on a cold night when we were close to the fire, "Do you think less of yourself for the things you've done?" I said, "Some of them, yes." She said, "That's the right answer." I said, "It's the only honest one." She said, "People sometimes think that admitting regret makes you weak." I said, "People are wrong about a lot of things." She looked at me for a moment with that steadiness. She said, "You're not what I thought you'd be." I said, "What did you think?" She said, "I thought you'd be harder, more defended." I said, "I'm defended." She said, "Not with me." And I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say. She was right. I was not defended with her. I was not sure how that had happened, or when, except that it seemed to have happened gradually over about 11 years of carrying a stone in a coat pocket, and then finding it again in a Laramie saloon. We came down out of the high country on the 12th day, and found ourselves on wide flat grassland that went further than you could see in the October light, brown and gold and silver where the frost had touched it. There was a homestead claim posted at a creek bend, abandoned from the look of it, a half-built house with one wall standing and a good stone foundation, and a well that still held water. I pulled Patch up and looked at it for a long time. Lena came up beside me and looked at it too. She said, "What do you see?" I said, "A foundation someone did right. That stone's solid. South-facing, creek 20 yards, good drainage. Whoever built this picked a good spot." She said, "Why did they leave?" I said, "Hard winter, probably, or trouble with money, or somebody died. People leave good places for all kinds of reasons." We sat there looking at it. The wind moved the tall grass in the flat beyond the creek. Somewhere up the draw, a hawk was working the thermals. She said, "What do you think about that foundation?" I said, "I think a man could build something worth keeping on it." She said, "What would he need?" I said timber for one, glass for 2 windows, decent roof iron, tools, some of that I've got, some I'd need to get. Month's work, maybe 5 weeks if the weather holds. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, do you know how to build a house? I said I've helped build 4, never started one alone. She said, but you think you could? I said I think we could. The wind moved the grass again, and Patch dropped his head to graze, and the hawk up the draw called once, a thin, high sound, and Lena looked at me with her steady eyes. She said, then we'd better get started before the weather turns. We worked it from the ground up. I want to say something about that, about the working of it, because I had done a lot of things in my life, and most of them had been about getting from one place to another, one job to another, one season to another, one season to another. I had been good at moving. I had not been good at staying. What I had not done in a very long time, maybe ever, was work towards something that was going to stay put after I was done with it. That was a different feeling in the bones. It was heavier and slower, and more satisfying than anything I could compare it to. I started on the east wall first because the foundation was truest there, and I wanted to understand what the previous builder had done before I added to it. He'd been a careful man, whoever he was. The mortaring between those stones was still tight in most places, and only needed repointing in 2 or 3 seams along the bottom course. I spent a full morning on that alone, working the old mortar out and packing new in, and Lena watched what I did and then took the trowel without asking and did the next section herself, and she did it right. She had the patience for it, the kind of patience that understands the work won't be rushed. She was not decorative about any of it. She did not stand at a distance and watch or ask useful questions from a safe remove. She hauled timber. She mixed clay for chinking, hauled the clay herself from a gray seam she found 20 yards up the creek bank. Good sticky stuff, better than what I'd planned to use. She held boards while I nailed them, and she held them steady, not just adequate but genuinely steady, like a person who understood that the straightness of what got built depended on the steadiness of her hands right now. She had an eye for level that was better than mine, and I told her so, and she accepted it without any performance, just nodded and kept working. What I remember from those weeks is the particular quality of tired that comes from building something. It is not the tired of riding or of fighting or of being tense and watchful for days. It goes all the way down, into the bottom of you, like water finding the lowest place, and it holds you still while you sleep, and you wake up and the first thing you think of is what you're going to do next, not out of worry but out of wanting to get back to it. I had not felt that in a long time. The cold came in harder around the 3rd week and we worked faster. I was glad of her, genuinely glad. Not in the way you're glad of extra hands, but in the way you're glad of someone who knows what they're doing and does it without needing to be managed. 2 people like that can do more than twice the work of one, because they don't work in sequence, they work together, the work finding its own rhythm between them. On a Friday morning, I'd been keeping rough track on a piece of board with a nail. We put the last of the roof iron in place and climbed down and stood back and looked at it. A house. Walls, roof, door that closed square, 2 windows with glass I'd ridden 2 days to buy and carry back wrapped in canvas. It was not large. It was not fine. But it sat on that good stone foundation on the south-facing bank above the creek, and it looked like it belonged there, like it had grown out of the ground rather than been put on top of it. Lena stood beside me and looked at it. I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think it's mine." I said, "Ours." She looked at me. She said, "Ours." We had been at the homestead site for about 5 weeks when a rider came in from the east. He was a young man on a good horse, and he carried a message from Harlan Creed. I was splitting wood when he came in. Lena was inside. The rider was polite and clearly a little uneasy, which probably meant Harlan had given him some version of what he thought of me, and the young man had formed his own assessment on the ride and concluded it wasn't his business. He handed me a sealed letter and said, From Mr. Creed for his daughter if she'll receive it. I said, give it to me and I'll take it in. He did, and he waited, and I went inside and gave it to Lena. She looked at it for a moment without opening it, turning it over in her hands like she was feeling its weight. Then she opened it. She read it standing by the window in the cold light. She read it twice. I did not ask. When she put it down, she said, "He's angry. He says I've shamed him. He says I'll regret it." She paused. "And then at the bottom he says the gray mare foaled and the foal is healthy and he thought I'd want to know." I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to write him back. I'll need paper." I had paper. She wrote at the table we'd built, and I went back outside to split wood, and the rider waited by his horse and did not make conversation, which was tactful of him. She came out after 20 minutes and gave the young man the letter, and he left. She stood in the dooryard and watched him go. I said, "All right." She said, "He'll come around. He is not a man who gives up things he loves without a fight, but he loves me. It'll take time." I said, "We have time." She looked at me. She said, "You keep saying that." I said, "It keeps being true." She almost smiled, the almost smile. November came in cold and genuine, and we settled into the life of the place. I made a pen for the horses and repaired the well housing and cut enough wood to last through February, stacking it against the south wall where it would be out of the worst weather. There were things still needing doing: a proper door bar, a second shelf in the main room, chinking in one corner where the wind found a thin seam, and I did them methodically, the way you work on something you intend to keep. I filed on the land claim at the county seat, which was a day's ride south and east, a small town with a land office run by a man named Pruitt who had ink-stained fingers and spectacles, and who looked at me the way county clerks look at weathered men who appear with money, carefully, making a private judgment about where the money came from. I paid in coin, and he took it, and the papers were processed, and I rode back with the deed, and a receipt folded in my breast pocket next to Lena's letter, both of them. I came back to find the smoke coming from the chimney and the roan in the pen, and through the window the yellow light of the oil lamp, and I stood for a moment with Patch's reins in my hand and looked at it. The house on the creek, my name on a deed in my pocket. The light in the window. It was not grand. It was not what Harlan Creed had built, which was what Harlan Creed had wanted to give her. But it was real, and it was solid, and it was ours in the plainest possible way, worked for, not inherited, not arranged, just built. I put Patch up and went inside, and Lena had supper going, and the room smelled of coffee and wood smoke. I put the papers on the table. She looked at them for a long moment and touched the edge of the page where my name was written as the claimant. She said, "Cal Whitmore." I said, "That's my name." She said, "It should say more than that." I said, "What else should it say?" She looked at me. She said, "I don't know yet. But I know it should say more." I understood what she meant, or I thought I did, and I thought about it for a couple of days, and then on a cold Tuesday morning, when the frost was still on the grass, I brought it up. I said, "I'd like to ask you something." She was mending a piece of harness, and she looked up. I said, "I don't have a church, and I don't have a preacher, and I don't have a ring to offer you. I have this land and this house and my word, which I know I've broken once already, and which I intend to never break again." She put the harness down. I said, "I'm asking you to stay, not because you don't have somewhere else to go, but because you want to be here. That's what I'm asking." She looked at me for a long time in the cold morning light. She was very still, the way she got still, when she was thinking something through to the end of it. She said, "I am here because I want to be here." I said, "Then will you stay?" She said, "Yes." She said it plainly, without performance, and it was the plainness of it that went all the way through me. Not a whisper, not a dramatic moment, just yes. The word a person says when they mean it entirely. She stood up and she came to where I was standing, and she put her hands flat on my chest, both of them, and she looked at me with those steady eyes. She said, You are not a man who makes a woman feel like a prize. You make her feel like a choice. Do you understand the difference? I said I was beginning to. She said, good. That matters. She left her hands there for a moment, and I could feel the warmth of them through my shirt, and she looked at me with that steadiness that was not soft and not hard but was just entirely clear, like a window that's been cleaned properly. The kind of look that sees a man. All of him. The gray in his beard and the cracked hat brim and the scar on his forearm and the two back teeth that were gone and the things he'd done that he was not proud of, and does not look away from any of it and still says yes. I put my hand over hers. We stood like that in the cold morning for what might have been a minute or might have been longer. The creek made its sound. The horse in the pen blew once and was quiet. The frost would be gone by noon. I want to say one more thing. A month later Harlan Creed came. He came alone, which surprised me. He rode a good bay and he came without fanfare, and he tied his horse at the rail I'd put in and he walked to the door and he knocked, which also surprised me. I answered it. He looked at me. He looked past me into the house, which had by then a table and chairs and curtains Lena had made from a bolt of cloth she'd traded for, and a shelf with her books on it, and the smell of something on the stove. He said, "My daughter in there." I said, "She is." He said, "I want to talk to her." I stepped back. He came in and Lena came out of the back room and she looked at her father and her father looked at her, and whatever passed between them was not mine to know. I went outside and unsaddled his horse for him and put it in the pen with food and water, because I thought it was the right thing to do, and because I had enough sense to understand that some things are not about me. They talked for a long time. When Harlan came back out, it was late afternoon and the light was going orange over the flat land to the west. He stopped beside his horse and looked at the house for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "She looks well." I said, "She is well." He said, "You got the roof on before the hard weather." I said, "We got it on." He heard the we in that. He did not say anything to it, but he heard it. He said, "That's good range land east of the creek." I said, "I know it. I mean to run some cattle come spring if I can get the stock." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know people." I said, "I expect you do." He looked at me for a long time with those eyes that had always measured me and found me short of what he needed. I did not know what they were doing now. I was not sure I could read it. Something in it was different, or I was reading it differently, or both. He was not a man who could say what he was thinking, not directly, not to me, and I was not a man who was going to push him. He put his hat back on and he got up on the bay, and he looked back at the house once. He said, "Tell her I'll send word about the gray mare's foal when she's ready to travel." I said, "I'll tell her." He rode east. I watched him until the dust settled and the light went long on the grass and the air smelled of cold coming. Then I went inside. Lena was standing at the stove. She had her back to me. She didn't turn around, but she said, "How was he?" I said, "He looked at the roof." She almost laughed. She said, "That's the closest he gets." I said, "He's going to send word about the foal." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Good." I hung my hat on the peg by the door, and I stood in the warmth of the house we had built, and I looked at her back, the way she was standing at the stove in the last of the afternoon light, her hair loose now and her canvas coat hung on the other peg. A woman in her own kitchen, in a house that sat on a good foundation, on land that had a deed with my name on it, and her somewhere in the papers, the way it should be. I did not deserve all of this. I knew that. I had been gone too long and done too much and come back too late and with not enough to offer. I knew all of that. But here was the thing. She knew it too, and she was here anyway. She had stood on the other side of a fence rail and listened to me say what I had to say, and she had thought it through to the end of it, the way she did everything, and she had brought the roan and the pack horse to the livery yard, and she had ridden out with me. That was not something I had won. You don't win a thing like that. It was something she had chosen. And the choosing was hers and the giving was hers, and that was exactly and precisely what made it the only thing in my life, in all 43 years of it, that I had been afraid to lose. I went to the stove and I stood beside her, and the warmth of the fire was on both our faces, and outside, the frost was coming back down onto the grass, and the creek was making its sound in the dark. She said, without looking up from what she was doing, "Are you staying in tonight?" I said, "Where else would I be?" She said, "Good." And that was all, and it was exactly enough.